Okay, let's get rocking. Hi, everybody. My name is Markham Schaffner. This is my colleague, Daniel Fenton. We work in the DC R&D Center, and the Esri product we work on is called the Hub. But today we're just going to be talking about telemetry and how to track user engagement with the software, specifically web apps that you have, and then how to improve that software based on information that you've gathered. So I'm going to talk a little bit about...
Excuse me.
Yeah, let's watch the projector a little. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what telemetry is, the history, and then how we can employ that with web apps. And then I'll hand it off to Daniel, who will give you a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of what kind of information you can consume and the decisions you can make based off of that information. So what is telemetry? It's the process of recording and transmitting the readings of an instrument. So an automated communications process by which measurements and other data are collected at remote or inaccessible points and transmitted to receiving equipment for monitoring. So basically, in layman's terms, gather information from somewhere that you aren't. So it could be something like a weather balloon. What's the temperature up there? What are the humidity levels? What's the wind current look like? Or a sensor on the ocean floor. What's the salinity levels or the pressure? Or maybe tags on a herd of animals to see where they're moving or what their survival rates are through sort of disaster weather events. So how does that apply to the web, or at least to the web in 2018? Now, monitoring a website might not be quite as cool as monitoring the surface of the moon, but the root concept is still the same. By definition, the web can extend and go to places that are remote. People will be accessing your site from somewhere that you have no idea unless you're measuring it. And that's where telemetry can be really valuable for you. The users of your website don't necessarily have to fill out feedback forms or comments about what they find useful or not. Simply by using a website and having a series of actions, your users are telling you how to improve that website if you're listening to what they're doing. This is a pretty simple feedback cycle. It's employed across a lot of industries and not just specific to telemetry, but the basic idea is to measure, get a sense of where you are, to learn based on the data you've collected, and then make decisions and take action based on that data. Once you do all that, measure again. Keep iteratively making your software more accessible or optimizing for whatever metrics that you prefer. And what we use for this is Google Analytics. It's the most used web tracking software in the world. It's been around for about a decade, or a little over a decade at this point. It's a freemium web analytics software offered by Google that tracks and reports web traffic. And basically what you'll do is create a unique identifier and then plug it into your software with a little snippet of JavaScript code, and that will send off little pings of information to Google Analytics, who will then take that information, aggregate it, and present you dashboards based on what information you have decided to send it. So things like page traffic, section views, which buttons people click, where they enter your site, where they leave your site, certain bounce rates. Just a lot of good information to understand so that you're not sending something out into the wild and you don't have any information to collect or make decisions based on in how it's engaging your users. And here's a slide of resources that help me understand and start using Google Analytics. I've seen people taking like photos of the slides. We'll send these out. Like, you will have access to these, so don't worry. And I'm going to hop out of Google or PowerPoint to show you what I'm talking about. So this is a small window that is now larger. Basically, you'll sign into Google Analytics. It's free, or at least the base level is free. Super easy to set up an account. And once you get things strung up, you can have a series of dashboards, like I was saying, that will tell you things like, where folks are viewing your site from, which pages they're landing on or routes they're accessing, how many people are live on the site right now, how many people have touched it over the last 90 days, a year, whatever it might be. And you can customize a lot of this in terms of what you think is the important information. But it's a really good vessel to take that telemetry that you want and turn it into something that you need. And I'll just show you briefly. You can have a series of accounts, i.e. Buckets. This is the product that Daniel and I work on, but I set up my own playground where you can have a series of sites and you create a new property if you want that key. And basically it just needs two pieces of information, a name for your website, and then the website URL that's tethered to that, and then you've got your key and you can get off and running. There are lots of good tutorials out there, and some of the resources that I linked earlier can walk you through that. So you don't need to know that right now, but you can get that set up very quickly. So with that, I'll hand it off to Daniel, and he'll give a deeper look at what we're talking about.
How about now? Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about actually implementing tracking in your web applications. And I just want to start out with just some kind of important principles when you're doing tracking. So one kind of gotcha is that when you build single page apps, as most web apps are now today, you often have to track the page views yourself. So you have to implement and we use Ember for our applications. We have kind of something that sits alongside the router and actually tracks the page views every time something changes. You could also put it in init hooks if you're using your framework, but an important thing to keep in mind is that on single page apps, you do have to track your own page views. Next principle is that you should not block user action with telemetry calls. Don't put a telemetry call before the user action. Don't make something wait for that telemetry call to finish. Take advantage of asynchronous functions in JavaScript. That means you're not going to be degrading your experience, waiting, because you need the telemetry call to happen. That's always kind of secondary to that user behavior. You want to log things after, and you want to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a position where an exception in telemetry will break your app. And one of the ways that we have architected Telemetry.js, which is what we use for the Esri User Experience Improvement Program, and is a library that you can use as well, is kind of try to protect the end user from throwing exceptions and breaking your apps for telemetry. So just keep in mind there that the tracking is secondary, right? It's the app that's most important. So if you find yourself trying to bend what your app is doing around the telemetry, try to rethink that, see, do I really need to track that, or is there a better way to do this? For example, including extra parameters in a URL, which I can log back as a page view. And then don't log sensitive or personally identifying information. If you are tracking users, you want to anonymize that. So Telemetry.js, if you initialize it with a portal object, will automatically anonymize the user. It uses a cryptographic algorithm that we cannot reverse that. Same thing for the organization. You want to remember, if you're dumping data into Google Analytics, that's public resource and potentially public resource, and you want to be careful about what you put in there. Some things to think about before you even get started with really tracking engagement are really around events. So we've kind of adopted the pattern that is built into Google Analytics, even as we've started feeding data into Amazon Analytics, of events fall into a few groupings. You have categories, which are really high level. And some of our categories I'll show you when you get into the analytics demo, but these are things that happen with regards to data. Or these are content creation. They're creating web maps and things like that. So you want to plan out in advance kind of what your groups of categories are, and that way you'll have meaningful aggregations when you're looking at analytics. So this much was happening in data relative to content creation. Really helps to have that planned out in advance. If you're working with a team of developers, you kind of want to have those specified out. So people aren't just making their own decisions. You don't end up with a big mess in Google Analytics that you have to clean up later and lose, for example, your history. Every time you change a category, you create discontinuities in data sets. You want to avoid that by planning ahead of time. So you have your categories, you have your actions, and you have your labels. Actions are things like click, autocomplete select, things of that nature. Labels would be like, what did they actually click? They clicked the KML button, or they selected the term water from the autocomplete list. So that label is the most granular after the action. So you just want to kind of think about these and plan them out. We, when we're being good, we'll actually put these into our user stories for what the telemetry is. So the event is this, or the category is this, the action is this, the label is this. We're going to track these three things. It's actually part of the user requirements for a story that we implement. Think about what your custom dimensions are. And these are things like, we have a data set ID everywhere, right? So that's not necessarily the label, but we want to be able to aggregate on it later. So with everything that might involve a data set, we're going to send the data set ID along with it. With Google Analytics, you have to set up your custom dimensions. You get the category action label for free, but you have to configure, this is a data set ID, this is an organization, etc. That is kind of like really special to my business logic. You want to plan that out in advance because otherwise Google Analytics will not recognize this extra information that you send along. And then think about what your user goals are and try to add some value to them. Even if there aren't kind of direct monetary values to these things, if you configure them in Google Analytics, you can see what's leading to goals. So for us, we have goals like they made a web map, or they made a story map, or they clicked the API link. We've assigned dollar values to those just relative to each other. And that allows us to see kind of who our most valuable users are, learn more about them. So actually, before I do the Google Analytics demo, I just want to show you quickly Telemetry.js, as promised by the title here. This library is up on NPM right now. You can use it. The source code will be opened up shortly. But it is our wrapper around both Google Analytics and Amazon Analytics. So as I mentioned, we use this for the Esri User Experience Improvement Program. So we have one library that you can configure and initialize with a portal self object. So it's meant to work, in the ArcGIS world, whether that's your own custom application initialized with portal self, or one of our Esri applications. So you initialize this. You may specify the important things for Amazon, like the user pool ID, these app names. You'll get that when you go through configuration in Amazon Mobile Analytics, which is being renamed, moved over to a service called Pinpoint. It's really the same thing. And then we just have some kind of simple tracking calls. There's really kind of two main things in our world. There's page views and there's events. So page views, remember, those kind of automatic tracking. Every time we land on anything, we log a page view. Again, we've bundled this into our router, so it's automatic. If you can make it automatic, that's great. Otherwise, put it kind of in init hooks for routes kind of as soon as these things load. We have our events, which is kind of a bundle of attributes. So you can see there category action label. So in this case, the category is the data set, everything that has to do with an individual data set. The action is attribute inspect, and the attribute they're inspecting was called crimes in 2016. And then we log that additional information, like the data set ID, what attribute they clicked on, the user, and then the user specifically gets anonymized. We log errors as well. That's nice to log because you can see where things are breaking. Google Analytics will actually tell you now when it's detecting anomalous rates of errors, which is really nice. You can see, something has gone wrong, but you got to remember to build that in beforehand as well. And then this higher level, which we're starting to implement, is our workflows. So a workflow is essentially just a collection of steps towards a goal. It's something that can be started or canceled or add steps along the way. It would be like, I'm making a web map, I'm adding a layer, I'm publishing. That would be a whole workflow. All these steps are collected together, and along with that, we will log the duration at each step. So that's kind of handled automatically inside the library. You can see, okay, it's typically taking people 3 minutes to publish a web map, for example. That's why you do want to use that workflow, so that extra kind of timing and cancel rates and things like that. So that's like kind of a higher level. And again, this is up here in our telemetry library up on NPM. Will soon be available. The source code will be available as well on GitHub. All right, so now I just want to show you some of the really key things inside Google Analytics. It's a user interface that has a lot of different features, and it's kind of like an onion. You can kind of peel them back further and further, but I'm just going to hit kind of the high notes here. So this is the real-time dashboard. You can see who's active on your site right now. Things I like to look at are like where are referrals coming from, active users, and as Markham showed, where around the world are people using this. Are people using mobile a lot right now or desktop? That's real time. It's not the most useful, but sometimes you want to see like events coming in. So we want to track, like, we just launched a feature. How many people are using the new download button or whatever that might be. We can kind of see events as they come in, or see if there's a lot of errors. It's good to be able to watch that around rollouts. Under the audience panel, you can really see like how many people are using your site over time. There's this key concept in both Google Analytics and Amazon Analytics of a session. A session is just kind of a contiguous use of the application. If I'm using the application and I stop and I come back within 30 minutes, that's still the same session. It's kind of tracking that user's behavior. Maybe I'm jumping between tabs. If I come back later in the day, that's a new session. And that's the key thing. We emphasize sessions over things like page views, unique users. Sessions is how much is this thing really being used. We have those as well. You can see in the last 30 days, 89,000 users with 115,000 sessions. Look at their duration, bounce rate. Bounce rate is the number of people that come to your site and then immediately leave. So they landed on the home page and they left, or the data set page for us and they left. That's a really kind of the highest level engagement metric is, did people actually stay on the site? Of course, session duration as well is important. A lot more information here. I'm not going to get into all of it. I will talk about the User Explorer briefly. This is a really great tool for doing research on your users. So we can go in and actually look at anonymized user sessions here and break this down by different segments. Like, I want to see all the user sessions of someone who downloaded something, or someone who made a map, or someone who experienced this error. And we can go in and, for example, see how they landed on the site, which in this case was organic search, and they viewed the Maryland Avenue streetscape data set after viewing the homepage. It actually goes up this way. So kind of navigated around, came back to a data set. But it's a really valuable tool here to be able to actually go back and see how people are actually using your site in an anonymized way, and how they got there. So again, you can kind of change some of these segments to say, I want to look at how people are doing that were referred in from this. All that happens inside Add Segment. I encourage you to use Markham's resources to learn more about how to use those. Acquisition is a really useful tab. That's going to tell you your breakdown between direct organic search, which is Bing, Google, Yahoo, AltaVista, what have you. Referrals, social. Referrals, people clicked a link from another site. Social, it's aggregating Facebook, Twitter links, etc., like that. But the really key part of acquisition is actually in this thing called the Search Console. So I'll just jump over here for a second and show you what this looks like. So in the Search Console, we can see things like, let's go to their new version actually. So we can see how the SEO is doing on our sites, how people are getting there. This is really nice for us. It shows you how important knowing that Googlebot can render your page is, because we had a broken page, and we fixed that, and all of a sudden our SEO came back. Something to keep an eye out for. There is a Fetch as Google tool within this. But you can see actually in this Performance tab what queries are leading into your site. So this is specifically hub.arcgis.com, and we can see over the last 30 days that 284 clicks came from this exact search term, ArcGIS Open Data. So you can see what people are searching for, how they're ending up on your site from organic search. You can see what pages they're landing on, how those things are trending over time, countries they're searching from, devices, etc. So this is kind of it is a separate tool, but it's really of one piece with Google Analytics. You kind of set this up at the same time, and Google Analytics kind of farms out this whole set of basically organic search tracking into this tool. All right, so I'm going to drop down now to the behavior overview. And this is where you're going to find things like what pages are people actually viewing. So you can see this here in the overview. So the top pages for us are, of course, home pages followed by data sets. We can see some of the top searches within the site. And this is something that you have to configure inside Google Analytics to tell it what your search terms are. So we told it that Q equals is our search term. And now it knows anytime it lands on /datasets, Q equals, in this case, parcels, it knows that was a search for parcels. We can actually see what people are searching for within the site. So if search is a feature of your site, you definitely want to configure your search terms within Google Analytics settings. There's a lot more information within site search. Just the key things to know are the search exits, which is they searched and they immediately left. Probably means they didn't find what they were looking for. So you can actually get into some of these views and see what search terms people are exiting from What are people looking for, not finding, and leaving? Right? Where are your gaps? And that's Markham talked about one way you can actually use telemetry to improve your application. So, errors are happening, or people are not finding what they're looking for, or they're not even using this feature at all. Maybe we shouldn't invest anymore. And then kind of the really key section of this is the events. All right, so here's where those categories that I talked about come in. And you can see we actually have two versions of this application that are feeding in events. And you can see we didn't really plan our categories ahead of time with the old ones. Those are all lowercase. And we have these discontinuities and data sets still feeding in data. That's why planning is important. But we've kind of rationalized these over time. So I can go in, I can see downloads, how many downloads are happening over time. So in the last 30 days on the site, 25,000 downloads. Go in and look at these different primary dimensions. So in this case, I want to see the different actions. So they were downloading zip files as the top one. And I can zoom in and see how downloads of zip files, for example, are trending. So events are really powerful. It's like, what are people actually doing on your site? And that's where I would spend the most time in your tracking is events. You want to know what people are actually clicking on. We will actually sometimes re-architect features a little bit, like add a copy button instead of just Control-C, because then we can see when people are copying an API link. That is really important to us to know, like when people are using the API. So that actually comes into the story itself. It's part of the implementation plan. Pages is important here. You can go in and see, again, what people are viewing, trending for each of those. So what's actually the top content on your site. That's all under the behavior tab. And then conversions comes into those goals that I talked about. So there we go. So we set up goals, which are like download a data set or view an API, and we can actually see how those are going over time. What the value of those is, where they're coming from, paths of those things. Goals are really valuable for us to kind of like figure out the relative worth of features. It's more of an art than a science when you're not really working with money, but still valuable for us. Cool. So two other tools that I just want to briefly go over just so you are aware that they exist. This is the Google Analytics Query Explorer, and this is a way to just get raw data out of Google Analytics, or like sampled data. But in this case, I wanted to get all of the search keywords that people have searched over the last year. And so I can build up these metrics, and these are things like total number of events or number of sessions. I can add dimensions, which are kind of like your X values, and then I can filter based off of it was on this domain or it was a user who downloaded. And then I can go and pull this data out. And it's going to give me a tabular view, and then it's going to actually print out the API call that it made, which is great because in our case, you can only get 100 at a time, but there were 889,000 different search terms over the last year. So you can take this and then just add kind of a simple loop to paginate over. So it gives you kind of what that API call is. It teaches you how to use a Google Analytics API. There are often things that I can't get inside Google Analytics itself, and I will go to this because I need the raw data. For example, in this case, I was going through so I could take a sample and categorize things so that we can use a machine learning algorithm to figure out, are they searching for a topic or an address or a data set? A really good way to get raw data out of Google Analytics and not have to kind of fiddle with the analytics dashboard itself. The last thing I just wanted to briefly show, this is the Amazon Analytics user interface. I'm not going to go over too much because it's migrating over to Pinpoint, but kind of similar things where you've got your dashboard, your important metrics. Really useful for us are custom events. And if you're using the Telemetry.js library, page views will actually log back as custom events because there's no concept of a page view in Amazon Analytics. Hence why we built that library for the user experience improvement program, is because Amazon Analytics is really bare bones. And the library that they distribute is really big. So Telemetry.js is one of as small as it can be, and we've kind of put these nice wrappers over it. So if you're using our library, you can see things like page views. So these are the total number of page views over time for our site, and then go kind of filtered down by like page URL, for example. if this will even load. There's a ton of URLs. But this is how you kind of work through. So more of a bare bones API. We end up using this in practice by loading all of the data into Redshift and then doing queries in like Power BI. We don't really use that interface too much. This is something that would be available to you if you're using Amazon Analytics. The reason that we use this is for FSMA compliance. So we can send all the data back in there, and it's kind of on our infrastructure within AWS. So if you have kind of data security requirements like that, can't be in public cloud, or that's a reason why you would want to use Amazon Analytics versus Google Analytics. So when in doubt, use Google Analytics because it's got a much more set of user-friendly and powerful dashboards and views and reports out of the box. With that, that's all I had to cover, so I will just open it up to any questions you might have. Yeah. So the question was about how to set up kind of your custom dimensions. Words used, but that's what you're asking about. Custom dimensions in Google Analytics, which is like our data set ID, which is like not a primitive in Google Analytics, but something we want to track like with every click, for example. Yes, that's documented in Google Analytics. It's briefly documented in the telemetry library, just saying that you would have to do this, and here's where you configure the telemetry library to know your custom dimensions, because you have to send them over in this specific format. That's all in the Google Analytics user interface. There is an API for it, but I find the Google Analytics APIs to be kind of Byzantine. The user interfaces are actually better. So telemetry offers initialization with the portal self workflow, so it'll actually detect the user and anonymize that for you. It'll detect certain things about the organization, like whether the user experience improvement program is enabled or disabled, which people that said, I don't want tracking here, turn this off. And also the workflows. So there's no concept of workflows in Google Analytics where it's going to track as people step through an actual process. Our primary use case was that as a team, we wanted to join the Esri User Experience Improvement Program, but we wanted to keep sending data to Google Analytics. So we're sending data off both places with one call, which is really valuable for us. But yeah, it's being adopted a lot just because we have requirements for where the data is stored for the bulk of the Esri User Experience Improvement Program.
When you use the custom dimension to track the users, for example, the user should log in, right? So for example, take the username.
Sure.
But you can send the view also to track the user. How about if the user didn't log in and you want to see just the landing pages, the login?
Sure. So questions about anonymous tracking. So both Telemetry.js and just native Google Analytics have the concept of a essentially a client ID, anonymous client ID, whether that person is logged in or not. So the user name is kind of a different concept than the client ID. So use telemetry, you end up with something in local storage, and it basically says, I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever. Whether they log in or not, they are still that. So there's still the anonymous tracker, and then that goes away when the browser gets cleared out or something like that. So you can still track anonymous page views if they're not signed in. That's really kind of a separate thing where you might want to do some like anonymous user profiling and see them over long periods of time when you're looking at like retention, for example, over long periods of time. But you don't really need that to look at kind of an individual over a short period of time. Anonymous works just fine. So the user would not be duplicated unless you actually had a full page reload. And in that case, it would just be another page view. It would be the same session. The session is the tracking session is outside of the user session. That's a completely separate concept. So they've logged. So and one of the things that we track is actually sign-ins. So they signed in as part of this session, and we still have that.
Was there a question in the back on this side? Early, did I see a hand up? No?
Hervey?
Yeah.
So you talked about the conversion goals.
Yeah.
Is there any way you go back and see what path the user was?
Yes. Yeah. So the question was about how do you actually see what paths people are taking. Yeah, and I can just show you that really quickly. So that is the goal flow. So for the download dataset goal, right? Started at Google. I guess they landed actually directly on the dataset page. Or we can zoom in and view the segment. In this case, it's only showing they came right in from Google and they downloaded a dataset. But yeah, you can see the pages, their entrance, the pages that they've landed on, et cetera. I think we can look at more level of detail. There's a lot of different settings in here. But yeah, the goals are really powerful to see how people are kind of navigating through your application. All right, well, thank you very much. Again, this is Markham Schaffner. I'm Daniel Fenton. We're both out of the DC R&D Center. We're on GitHub. We're on Twitter. Find us, ask your questions. Please rate our session.
And you should have access to the presentation after the summit ends. We'll send it out. Thanks.